Cool. Hello, everyone. Here we go. So I'll do a quick about us. Like you said, we will not be rhyming today, thankfully. I don't think anyone can deal with that right before lunch. And we will try and keep this on time if we can. So I'm Kane. I'm very much a blue teamer these days, and of course, security spreadsheet manager. I led the enterprise security teams at Atlassian, Shopify, and now at Canva. So I've been building zero trust networks since about 2017.
Howdy, I'm Clancy, Kane's evil twin and overall troublemaker. I used to look for mischief as part of Atlassian's detection and response team, but now I just cause it instead as part of their red team.
Cool. So this is a bit about our agenda today, and sort of the TLDR is I'll be explaining about building zero trust networks, and then Clancy will be knocking us down very much after that. So before we talk about breaking stuff, we kind of need to know what it is, and so I want you to imagine for a second that it's the year 2177. And of course, presenters are still giving explanations on what zero trust is. So I wonder when we can stop doing this, and I will keep it very short for those of you who already know. So in the olden days, we had a castle and moat approach. You had the VPN acting as the single bridge to get in, and pretty much that was it. But kind of as time went on, SaaS added to this problem because it was often outside of that protected layer. And adding to this weak authentication, bad device security posture, and sort of people using their personal devices kind of added problems to this. And once attackers got past the perimeter, they kind of had access to everything. And yes, we had defense in depth. We had segmentation and VLANs, but realistically, attackers could pivot. And so it kind of led us to a bit of a one trust boundary. aka all of your eggs in one basket. And so Zero Trust was designed to fix some of these issues and sort of be a cloud-first approach where maybe you didn't have an office network or maybe you had hybrid designs. Now, one of the problems you will get when speaking to, I feel vendors especially, but generally people, is that people have different understandings of what Zero Trust is, and there's not really a single definition. And so kind of the example I will be using here is Google's, and there's kind of 3 points. And these two are actually quite easily to summarize. The first one is try and push everything up to the application layer. And the second is use access control, things we should be doing anyway, I think, generally in terms of security. But this last one, though, this one needs a little bit more of an explanation, because I think this is really getting into the core of what Zero Trust is and how it works. So you need a secured company-owned device, usually with a certificate on that device or an agent. You need a strongly verified user using unphishable two-factor authentication, something like a security key or passkeys. And you need policy enforcement points. And what I mean by this is on your IDP, or maybe even your VPN if you've got it, or maybe even cloud infrastructure. You need somewhere where you are going to check the posture of the device that's connecting and like the security of the user, so like checking their two-factor status. And this is not just checking the certificate, but it also might be checking operating system version, I don't know, Chrome or browser version, whatever you really want to be checking. And so I'll show you Zero Trust in the real world, which is a couple of examples that I've got here. Now, the first is a very simple SaaS example. This is what I call like a two-tier model. So we start at the top, we have a PKI set up, and we have MDMs, and that deploys certificates to our managed devices. Now, when me, a user of a managed device, wants to go access, I don't know, Salesforce, Jira, one of my services, I go through the IDP, and either the IDP or some sort of extra tool that's been plugged in will check the posture of my device, and that will allow me to access production services or sensitive things. Now, you may also have BYO devices that can just access public things like Zoom or Google Meet, that kind of thing. So generally, you have all your sensitive stuff in one, all your public stuff in another. And here's an example from Atlassian, and this is a little old. This is from 2019, hence the words radius on the screen, so I don't want to scare anyone there. That is no longer in, but it's a similar approach, and you can kind of see the similarity in the design. The only difference is there is a 3-tier model. So the idea is that high tier is your sensitive services, your user-generated content, that kind of stuff. Low tier might be things like Slack, might be things like email, might be things that are still sensitive, but maybe not as much. And then open tier, again, is the public stuff. And really the big difference is that BYO devices would need to enroll in some service, download some agent. They need to go through some checks before they can access stuff in that low-tier bucket. I'm going to go through a few zero-trust attacks and misconfigurations. And this whole bit just got taken from me in the last slide, so I'm not going to talk about Swiss cheese networks again. I'll save you that. But I will give you some very cursed AI-generated cheese analogies. So I want you to imagine that the cheese in this case is our security control. And so misconfigurations can be accidental, or they can be purposeful. The reality is that companies can't do zero trust 100%, and so sometimes they do need to poke holes in, but the holes can also be accidental. And so this is a few common misconfigurations I see, and these can happen all the way through the stack, from initial access to pivots to basically anything. Basically, my advice to any red teamers out there, if you are attacking a zero trust network, is go off the paved path. Like if the company is all Windows all the time, try Macs, try like mobile devices, try different user agent strings, that kind of thing. And I want to deep dive into 2 of these because I see these so much, and they're definitely ones that are quite difficult to secure, I think. So the first is 2FA and device recovery. So it can be quite hard that if a user loses their hardware or their 2FA, how do IT then validate that user? And if you have offices, this is easy. You just say, hey, come on in, and we'll sort it out. But the reality is that with AI techniques, deepfakes, that kind of stuff, it's really hard to do this remotely. And so it is quite hard to verify a user if you are a fully remote company these days. The second is, and I kind of mentioned this, just try different user agent strings. Like, seriously, you would be surprised. Like, companies will roll out zero trust because they're managing their Windows or their Macs really well, but they've got like 100 Linux users who are like hiding in the basement somewhere, and they can't be bothered to manage them, or they can't manage them, and so they just go, oh yeah, we'll just let those through, and that's fine. And so if you can get a user's credentials, I would say just try different checks. Like, it's very easy. Now I've got control avoidance, which is just going around the cheese in this case. I won't dive into this too much, but generally speaking, zero trust is user and device focused. What I mean by going around the cheese is don't target users and devices. Look at APIs, applications, service accounts, because these things will not be protected by these controls, and so you will just not be blocked. And finally, we just have going through the control. What does this mean? So this means compromising the user, their device, or both. And so while zero trust strengthens these controls, it does not make them infallible. And finally, I think insider threat is a really interesting one. Like, you can just pay someone to give you the data you need. You don't need to do any hacking, right? And so I think there's a lot of potential ways in, and this is kind of the 3 ways I would categorize most of the attacks.
All right, let's talk hacking now. I was feeling a little bit awkward just standing around on the side. All right, so Kane has covered off on some of the high-level concepts surrounding attacking zero-trust architecture, but I'd like to drill down into some of the greatest hits, nuances, and how they can be pieced together. So, oh, come on. You wouldn't happen to be tethered, would you, Kane?
No, I think this GIF might not load.
All right.
Carry on.
Well, it is Eric Andre screaming to be let into a gate.
I will do a demo for you.
Yeah, please, Kane, please. So let's talk a little bit.
Let me in!
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about recon and initial access. So I'll assume you're all relatively familiar with the usual suspects here, but I'll try to zero in on things that are either particularly effective or unique to zero trust architecture. So, sorry to be the bearer of the coldest take of all time, but even in the futuristic nirvana of zero trust, people are still the weakest link. This is going to be a... Can you do the graph as well, please?
I don't think I can do that one.
That's all right. We'll, a lot of our bits are going to kind of fall flat here, but we'll keep powering through. So imagine a big, pretty graph. So in terms of achieving initial access, phishing and social engineering remain the biggest attack vectors in our industry. It's economical, effective, and enables further exploitation the vast majority of the time. You almost can't go wrong spooling up phishing campaigns, in addition or concurrently to other bids for initial access. So I do want to recognize that zero trust done well can significantly reduce the blast radius of successful phishers or funnel attackers into detection choke points, but it's far from a silver bullet. As long as there are going to be ways to trick people, attackers are going to find ways to do so in order to overcome controls. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the weeds about the various types of phishing, but I did want to note that generally, user credentials are significantly weaker in... I was just checking that it was there this time. Significantly weaker in correctly implemented zero-trust environments. The presence of stuff like phishing-resistant MFA, passkeys, device certificate checking makes them almost completely worthless if they're done correctly, and you'll need to find methods to avoid those controls. Fortunately, there are often many, many ways to do so, so we'll cover off on that later. On the other hand, phishing for code execution or getting the target to perform actions for you can be particularly strong in zero-trust environments, because doing so effectively allows you to piggyback off of the trust afforded to your target. So generally, either of these will mean you've got less hoops to jump through later down the line, although code execution does have a higher technical cost of entry. I know the brief said techniques without utilizing malware, but executing on target is incredibly powerful, and I think it warrants a quick mention. So execution on target here will often net you things like access to credentials on disk, access to internal networks, and importantly, session token theft. So to briefly expand on the power of session token theft, consider the process for logging into a production AWS account. You need to tap your credentials, you need to provide your credentials, tap your YubiKey, provide your device certificate, then fulfill several device posture checks before you're let in. And if all of that looks good, you're given a session token to authenticate with. Session token theft essentially boils down this laborious process to yoink. I'm so sad about this. It's the cat going side to side, which saves us a lot of heartache. A solid EDR solution and detection and response team goes a ways to increasing the difficulty of this. But as a defender, you need to verse yourself with the common methods of token theft and protect against them. As a general rule of thumb, any non-standard accesses to places where tokens are stored, particularly for browsers, is pretty sus. So utilizing malware is a lot of work to go through, though, and there are often many easier ways to get your mitts on session tokens. So we could instead just, ask the user for it. If we can convince them to just grab the session token directly from Chrome and shoot it across to us, then we're chilling. We don't need to faff around with malware R&D or anything like that. They're often stored in things like HAR files as well, which are commonly shared for debugging purposes. So if you can ask them to generate a HAR file for you, shoot that across to you, or nab it from a support portal, then also you're kind of chilling. Cool, so after having dunked on user credentials a little bit, they still do have their use. I want to reiterate that MFA is not a silver bullet, and also not all MFA is created equal. There are many MFA implementations that can be phished. In addition to that, a lot of the time there are going to be SaaS products that fall outside of the walled garden, or things that don't support SAML. Or you'll be able to do other things like hit their APIs or abuse the infrastructure that's actually supporting zero trust in the first place, amongst many other things. So speaking of which, said infrastructure can introduce some pretty solid surface area. So for instance, MDMs and VPNs can be pretty great avenues for credential validation, password spraying, and general shenanigans. It's not uncommon for a lot of these to have pretty lackluster controls or super crusty APIs that you can hit for enumeration and exploitation. So some other quick honorable mentions before I move on. Squatting or hijacking targeted dependencies, especially if you're in a white box engagement, can be very strong. Stealing leaked credentials like app passwords, keys, tokens, service accounts, or anything else that allows you to bypass zero trust, really good. And importantly, bot accounts or credentials that are used for things like robotic process automation are particularly valuable. Like a lot of the time, they have zero trust or detection carve-outs, as well as significant levels of access. It's pretty normal and expected for like Jira scraper bot to scrape Jira, go figure. So finally, as well, for engagements, you have things like routine scans of the perimeter and utilizing NDA can be quite fruitful, but bear in mind that you're going to be competing against the free market on that one. On that note, if you have ODay to spare, then of course you can use that too, but if so, you probably don't need to listen to this talk. Cool, so let's take a look at a brief hypothetical example to put all the pieces together. So let's imagine we're all part of a cybercrime group and we've successfully phished the credentials of a HR employee, and coincidentally, the company that they work for utilizes Zero Trust. Right off the rip, we'll have access to all of the SaaS products that fall outside of their walled garden, which we might be able to use for exploitation and escalation. But what if we want to get access to the stuff inside the walled garden? Well, what do we do then? Let's take a little bit of a look at Kane's simple example from earlier. Our expectation is that upon trying to authenticate using our stolen credentials, we're going to run into a wall, right? We don't have a valid device certificate. We don't have access to the user's MFA. Sad days, we're out of luck, right? Well, practice has the tendency to snatch the textbook out of theory's hand and bash them over the head with it. So this particular user doesn't have any hardware MFA configured and is using push notifications instead. And we're actually able to enumerate that prior using the MFA provider's API with their credentials. So due to this, we're allowed to register our own hardware MFA in addition to the user's default option of using push notifications. So whilst this does prompt the user with an MFA notification, we get lucky and they mindlessly prove it to make the strange box go away. So after which, we've got persistent access to applications in the open tier. So things that require credentials and MFA, but no specific device certificate. Fortunately, IDP is also linked to Active Directory, and so we're able to enumerate the user's group memberships, which gives us an idea of their levels of access and any other opportunities for privilege escalation. But what if we want to go even further than just the open tier? Fortuitously, the company just happens to support bring your own devices, and after a little bit of prodding, we're able to discover that we can use our access to self-service enroll our very own device into the MDM. Pictured here. This is going to push down a BYOD certificate to our device, which then expands our level of access from the open tier to the low tier, or anything, well, that is, anything requiring credentials, MFA, and a BYOD device certificate. So to do a little bit of a quick stock take, in theory, we should have access to applications that are either outside of the walled garden or in the open or low tier. In addition to that, we also have additional information from the software and configurations that will push down to our BYOD device. So this surface area is going to almost always contain opportunities for exploitation, many of which are going to be thought unreachable by the people that design these systems and present softer targets for us to look at. Generally, as the breadth increases, it becomes harder and harder for defenders to cover the entire surface area. So utilizing our access, we'll be able to do things like looting emails, looking at documentation, starting to steal some IP, looking through messages for credentials and stuff like that. Or utilize the inherent trust of some of the accessible applications in order to launch more sophisticated phishing attacks. Additionally, and I think the final thing there is usually we'll get some level of internet access or routability to things that might not have been available beforehand. But what if we really, really want to access those high-tier applications, the ones that require a managed device certificate? Well, say we identify that our user has access to two sensitive apps via their group memberships from earlier. Both of them are in the high tier, right? We don't have a managed device certificate, nor do we really have a way of obtaining one. We can't steal their laptop. We can't get the certificate provider to give us their certificate. So let's just try and access sensitive app number one and see what happens. Womp womp. We get denied, and it's due to not having a correct certificate, as we expected. However, upon trying to access it, IDP helpfully is going to push down routes to those applications so we can actually talk with them, allowing us to reach them directly. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for us, it appears that sensitive app number one has been misconfigured to allow authentication via a SAML or a basic authentication, which allows us to bypass the controls and just directly log in anyways. Let's try the same with sensitive app number two. This time around, it looks like they are correctly enforcing SAML. So, out of luck? Not quite. It looks like the sysadmin here has forgotten to disable the API, so we're able to just authenticate using our basic auth credentials and then have full access to the app as well. Let's consider an additional part in this hypothetical. Let's say that the people management system is in the low tier. Intuitively, that makes sense, right? Like when you design these systems, people need to take leave regardless of what kind of device they're using. However, it's also being used as a source of truth for Active Directory. And since our user works in HR, then they have admin permissions and are able to control the people management solution. In turn, this is going to give us arbitrary control of the group memberships effectively, which we can abuse to escalate our privilege. So what went wrong with all of this? I guess in a nutshell, the company's zero trust implementation just wasn't complete. There were several holes that could be used to bypass controls entirely. There was a partial adoption of phishing-resistant MFA, which hadn't quite reached the critical mass required to be reliably effective here. So utilizing like a hardware MFA, like a YubiKey, would have completely prevented our initial MFA spamming vector. Services that had sensitive data or controlled access to sensitive data just shouldn't have been in the low or open tier to begin with. And finally, there are several misconfigurations which allowed us to bypass zero trust, as well as several applications that just simply weren't gated by zero trust in the first place.
Okay, let's wrap this one up. So what Clancy talked about were not theoretical examples. Like all of these techniques have been used in the wild as well. And just to take you through a few examples here, I think the recent Okta breach is probably the best example where the attacker got access to credentials through a personal Google Chrome, and the passwords were synced to their personal account. They managed to get in and then get into a support portal for Okta, and they used HAR files that were stored in their customer service desk in order to get session tokens that could get access to customers. And then once they got access into customer systems, they then use APIs to bypass those customers' device security controls. So almost like poking through two zero trust networks, almost in that example. LastPass had two malware incidents, one on a corporate machine, one on a personal machine, that then pivoted, and Shopify just had insider threat. So an external actor just paid internal people in order to take data for them and give it to them. Very simple. And like, we've talked about a lot of attacks that are possible, but I think the core is that it's still a very good thing, especially when it's done well. Smaller businesses might struggle with zero trust. I'm not going to lie on that front, especially if you deal in ICS or physical systems. You may have to have some sort of hybrid network, and that's almost unavoidable in many situations like that. But I think, as we've seen, attackers, they adapt to the landscape. Like, if you raise the bar, the attacks will just raise as well. And I think that is something to obviously be mindful of, and then you need to look at other controls to deal with those things as well. But one thing I will say that's maybe a boon is zero trust, when I started building it in 2017, was custom. Like, you had to do everything yourself. Like, you needed software devs, you needed security engineers, you needed your own PKI. Vendors these days are getting very close to maybe not an off-the-shelf solution, but they can connect into all of the tools that you already have. And so you probably don't need developers to do this anymore. But the downside is it still does have a cost. Like, if you are a BYO-heavy company, yeah, like, you're not going to be able to do it, right? Like, you need corporate-owned devices, and that comes with a cost. You might need security keys. That additionally comes with a cost. But I do think pass keys are going to be a bit of a help here, because the cost is much lower, and they are much easier to implement. But it's not infallible, right? And so, like, zero trust is a small part of a wider enterprise security program. So you still need to think about things like, application control, enterprise browsers, and of course, just having good incident response, because you're not going to be able to stop all of the breaches. And these are some of sort of our predictions for the future. I can really boil this down to more malware, more phishing, and employees with exceptions. I think support portals, customer service desks, external contractors, that kind of thing. It's harder to secure in these environments unless you literally give them a security key and a laptop, which is a high sort of cost for a lot of companies. They're probably going to be using their own devices. They're probably going to be having exceptions in your network. And I think even just looking for examples where these attacks were used, it was really hard. Like, almost every attack was either phishing credentials or phishing with some sort of OTP stealing. And so I think the majority of attacks are compromising weak user accounts and doing cred stuffing still. And so I think the biggest offender takeaway here is just use strong MFA if you can. Like, use passkeys everywhere on every employee, no exceptions, ideally. And I think there's a lot of improvements coming where you can use strong MFA now from device enrollment to forever, basically. So there's not this gap at the beginning like there has been where you need to use a worse MFA and then sort of add a better one. And that's it from us. Thank you very much.
I am a super genius.